Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the last session in the PIPC room for today. The session will explore whether financial markets infrastructure matter in a distributed environment. So to lead the session, we have Stephen Linnell, CEO from Banks of Africa. The Q&A session we will deal with after the session. So there is a roaming mic or a floating mic that will go around. So as soon as Stephen is done, we'll give you an opportunity for some questions. So without any further ado, over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you. So when I was a young boy, my father had this really annoying warning phrase for me whenever I was either coloring outside of the lines or doing something generally that I shouldn't do. And it was normally preceded with a thorough thrashing. But he would say to me, "Stephen, read the signs, read the signs." And this memory came to me recently when the PASA team reached out and said, could I participate in this really fantastic payments conference? And so the first warning sign that I was in trouble popped out when they delivered my topic to me, and it was on a subject that seemingly had nothing to do with payments. Second warning sign was when I received the PIPC presenters guidelines. It was in an email that seemed just addressed to me, and it had these oddly specific requests in it, and notices such as less is more, and please, 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 please stick to the allotted time frame. So warning signs, warning bells ringing. In any event, thank you for joining me here today. For those of you who have also missed the signs, I hope that today we'll just plant the seed that will germinate into some action amongst financial market infrastructures down the line. But before we get into that, just a very quick introduction. Thank you for that. Stephen Linnell, I'm literally 5.5 days into the role at Banks of Africa. For those of you who don't know, Banks of Africa is a payment clearinghouse, facilitates interbank obligations that arise from retail payments. And yes, topically, it is also a regulated financial market infrastructure. So we're in the spotlight today. The argument that I would like to position this afternoon goes as such. Firstly, that financial markets as a whole have not kept pace with available evolution of underlying technological competencies. And because of that, we haven't been able to catalyze on the benefits that could accrue from it. Secondly, financial market infrastructures that form the foundation of financial markets today have failed to catalyze on that infrastructure change as well. And if we accept that these two premises are true, then the real question is there a future for financial market infrastructures? Now, before we get into all of that, just very quickly, a little rundown of what I'm looking to cover today. First of all, we'll do a couple of whats. What is financial market infrastructure? We'll see how it's set up, and you'll see that it's stubbornly centralized in nature. Secondly, we'll look at what is distributed ledger technology, blockchain, and we'll see how it's created an entirely new market with digital assets and decentralized finance. Then we'll take a step back and we'll look at the evolution of the way financial market infrastructures are set up, and we will contrast this to the available technology that is there for them to use. And unfortunately, we'll notice that they haven't tracked well. Because they haven't tracked well, we'll have to ask the question, is there a future for them? And I'll make the proposal that yes, indeed, there is a future for them, but perhaps not in their current setup. There's a tweak towards a decentralized model that they should take heed of. And then lastly, we will dip into decentralized finance, and we will just look briefly around some of the core underlying components, the ways to accrete towards an operating model like that, and just touch on some of the important decisions that have to take place. So what is an FMI, or what are market infrastructures? They're a multilateral system for participants to focus on the trading, clearing, and settlement and recording of transactions or payments or securities. Now, These financial markets infrastructures together offer the ability for standardization, automation, and also just generally speeding up the processes that are needed in today's modern financial markets. And this reduces the cost of transacting, and it also reduces the risk of transacting. And so they bring about trust. And with trust increases confidence, and with confidence, so does transactions. And transactions in a confident environment has a positive flywheel effect. So in today's world, they're unobjectively mission critical. There are about 5 subcategories of financial market infrastructure, which I'll quickly take you through. Firstly, exchanges. Simply put, these are places to buy and sell securities. We've got a number of them in South Africa. Very briefly, we have the JSE. The JSE sort of is a full-scale exchange. It allows trading across all assets, spot through to derivative, and across the various asset classes. We've got A2X, which is a complementary secondary market for the trading of equities specifically, and then we've got Cape Town Stock Exchange, and they tend to focus more on the SME sector for bond issuance and equity issuances. We then have CCPs. CCPs are really risk mutualizing entities. They interpose themselves in between two counterparties to a particular transaction, and they look to offset the risk that come about through either introduction of certain processes, such as margin payments or netting sets, or through capital optimization mechanisms, such as the default waterfall or just the utilization of clearing member balance sheets. These are, given their construct, they tend to be natural monopolies. And I see the LSE group just outside the door here. So a good case in point is LCH SwapClear, which is a subsidiary of the LSE group. Currently, today, it clears 90% of the world's cleared OTC derivatives. Natural monopoly. You want to concentrate that risk so you can manage it centrally. CSD, really their focus is on safe custody of securities, safe custody plus the settlement thereof. And also just outside the door, we've got Straight, which is the primary local CSD across all asset classes. We also have Granite CSD, which is a much smaller one focusing on the debt market. Trade repositories, very simply, central database for the recording of transactions. And here, this is a place where South Africa has perhaps fallen behind on global trends. We're one of the few countries within the FSB community that does not yet have an enforced trade reporting regime for OTC derivatives. And then lastly, payment systems. Again, just a mechanism to move value between counterparties. Ding, ding, ding. Just for the record, collective sigh of relief. I've mentioned the word payment. We are now fully in the scope of this conference. So with that, we're going to go back off piste again. So you probably have noticed that in each of the 5 that I've covered here, the word centralized has dominated. And it is true. Look at the diagram. FMIs or market infrastructures sit at the center of a connected node, and they act as the authority in that context. Staying with what is distributed ledger technology and what are distributed ledgers? So broadly speaking, it's a group of systems that process and store transactions across a broad array of computers or nodes, and they do so on a decentralized and secure basis. When we talk about distributed ledgers, we typically classify them between permissioned and permissionless implementations. On the permission side, this talks to a situation where you have a gatekeeper that determines who can enter and who can leave. On the permissionless, it's really open to anyone to create a node on that particular network. And we've typically seen with permission networks, they tend to be faster, they tend to be less energy consumptive, and they tend to allow a little bit more flexibility in their governance structures. So one can modulate the amount of transparency, for example, in a particular network. On the flip side, though, they do tend to lead towards fragmentation, which in a market infrastructure tends not to be good. And their decision around which one to deploy is really important when considering digital assets. Digital assets really are a digital means of recording value on a secure network or a distributed ledger. Why do we care? So we care largely because there's implied benefits that this technology can bring to the financial markets. Security, given the way that they append transactions to the ledger as opposed to amend them, they offer an immutability that's not typically available in a typical database setting. Efficiency, without a central intermediary to get in the way of or processing happens across the network and so tends to be more efficient. Transparency, again here because the recording of transactions happen across the network simultaneously. They are transparent and available across the board. Resiliency, again distributed, anything tends to be less at central risk of a point of failure. Quick segue, definitely worth reading Nassim Taleb's book on anti-fragility. Really nothing again to do with payments, but just to sort of get your head into the concept of what brings about resiliency. And then lastly, equality. Again, there's no central authority in most of these constructs, and as a consequence, they're born out of equality. Now, as a whole, what is DLT trying to do in the financial market? It's trying to move one away from the sequential processing, trade, clear, settle, record, into a distributed, simultaneous processing environment. And if that works, it begets value. A related concept is the blockchain. The blockchain is just a subset of distributed ledger technology whereby transactions are recorded through a chain of blocks in a cryptographic manner. Hashtag, easiest definition in the world. And for those of you who are, I guess, light on competence and time, like myself, any presentation you've got to give, blockchain's a great one to give a definition on. It's really easy. Blockchain, chain of blocks, record all. So use it, don't use it. Anyway, this concept has been around for a while. It's not new, but it's really only in the last 15 years or so that I'd say the talk or the concept has emerged out of the basements occupied by cryptographers and computer scientists. And we started talking about cryptocurrencies. Now, I guess what's important though, and we've covered some of the benefits, but this is a relatively nascent technology from an implementation perspective, and so it does still come with some health warnings. Now, I'd like to argue that most of the health warnings that I'm going to give here are themselves nascent. They will abate through the maturation curve, and so I think they're just worth taking heed of as we look to implement. Security, just general lack of broad understanding around the security competency within the chain network. Interoperability, they tend not to play nice with things that exist today, and so we have this inability to move between environments. Ambiguity, particularly in terms of settlement finality. Legality, the DLT network itself has questionable legal or legality in certain jurisdictions, and so there's some uncertainty there, and then also just sort of governance, how to deploy this. Okay, so the English lesson is over, but I'm afraid you're still stuck in school. We're going to the history lesson now, and for this section, I just want to talk a little bit about how technology has evolved through time. And you'll see technology has gone through this flip-flop process from processing centrally to processing on a decentralized basis and then back again. In the early 1950s, the first computers were mainframes. Stuck in a big building, you go to it, you use it, you go home. That's pretty much how it worked. Unfortunately, as things developed, the reduction in the size of chips and just general production capabilities brought the cost of computing power down, and so entered sort of personal computing space in sort of the 70s and 80s. And this was great. I could take something home, or perhaps not take it home. I could leave it on my desk, at least at home, and I could process from it. Personal computers were great, but unfortunately, the applications that ran on these computers started to get more and more complex. And as they got more complex, they started rendering the use of personal computers inoperable. And it was luckily at that time that we started seeing the evolution or the creation of cloud computing. So anyone with a personal computer could access massive amounts of power over the internet. And you can see we've gone from centralized to distributed, back to centralized in cloud computing. But not all of us live next to a data center. So when we were trying to run applications that are latency sensitive, autonomous cars, is a case in point, started realizing that the processing power available on the client side was just inefficient or insufficient. Unfortunately, today we've started seeing the evolution of edge computing, which is bringing back some of that sort of processing power to the end user. And again, that's a model of decentralization. So again, flip-flop, ending at decentralization. Similarly to technology, markets themselves have evolved and are no stranger to the flip-flop process. Sort of the financial markets we operate in today has sort of largely been formed out of the Industrial Revolution, where we just had this sort of interconnected trust network run by banks. They would process transactions on the back of global commerce, and they would do it on a double entry bookkeeping system. But this peer-to-peer network was an example of a decentralized capability. Then any system that is built on the practical way of trade at scale is likely to have some mishaps or missteps. And so we started to see the introduction of intermediated finance, initially with clearinghouses in the 1800s. They were brought on to reduce the cost of transacting in the market and obviously the risk that flowed through. Then with computer powers picking up, we started seeing the dematerialization of securities. We saw the automation of the dual entry bookkeeping system. We saw the ability for people to record and store assets on behalf of third parties. And then this sort of central intermediation of FMIs really came to the fore post the GFC. You would see the regulatory reform post the GFC really started putting pressure on market infrastructures to be resolute, and beyond that for participants to use market infrastructures. So hell, okay, now we sit in a mess. We sit in a situation whereby we've got this financial market which is fundamentally intermediated by these centralized FMIs, and yet we've got available to us this computing capability that is decidedly leaning towards a decentralized framework. A decentralized framework that has enabled digital assets and begets the enablement of decentralized finance. And in this model, one has to ask, is it necessary to intermediate digital assets? And if it's not necessary to do so, then do we really need financial market infrastructure at all? Now here I'm going to start attempting to sing for my own supper, and I'm going to argue yes, we do need financial market infrastructures. In spite of markets being intermediated by market infrastructure and market infrastructure being centralized, this doesn't mean that this is the only way that they have to operate. In fact, this creates an opportunity for a new archetype to be introduced. And it's an archetype where financial market infrastructure is able to effectively devolve their function on a distributed basis into the network that they operate themselves. So as opposed to functioning it outside the loop from a governance perspective, they devolve their functionality into the network itself. And we'll call this particular concept a decentralized financial market infrastructure, so DFMI. Before exploring this a little further, it's worth just holding up the different operating environments that can play out. Operating environment that we know today and the operating environment of decentralized finance. If we take it through sort of the traditional trade life cycle, we start at the custody of assets, and you see under a DeFi construct, these are held by users in non-custodial wallets, as opposed to going to an intermediary to hold your assets on your behalf. Same too with execution. Here we have smart contracts that operate directly on a user's assets, as opposed to going to an intermediary to execute on your behalf. Clearing and settlement. Clearing and settlement takes place the minute there's a record executed on the chain, as opposed to, again, this tend to be lengthy process of clearing and settlement in an off-chain environment. Collateral markets will shift quite discreetly. In a DeFi environment, there tends to be over-collateralization. In the traditional market, there tends to be under-collateralization. And then lastly, in terms of governance, the governance, as I mentioned, under a DFI construct is one where that enforcement is deployed into the protocol itself and not run on the outside. Of course, this model of DeFi is fundamentally different to how we operate today. And given that there are many paths under which we can accrete to such an endpoint. On the one hand, it can be slow, incremental, and benign. On the other hand, it can be fundamentally transformative. The way that I would perhaps argue we should approach this, and certainly FMI should approach this, is somewhat of a middle line where FMIs themselves start deliberately tokenizing the assets, legacy assets that they have available today, and that they start merging that environment with native digital tokens. All of this, of course, managed under a DFMI construct. Unfortunately, DeFi today, in the way that it has rolled out, has undermined its own business case. They tend to be siloed, they tend to be incomplete, and they tend to be inoperable with each other. And this bears out probably from the fact that, decentralized finance has its legacies almost in zeal against traditional finance. And so there's this rebellious, almost anarchic response to traditional finance. It's also driven by commercial intent. And so people are trying their own different thing. And then just generally experimentation. So we do sit in a situation where we have sort of a hodgepodge of decentralized financed modes in the market. And this is really where I would argue FMIs themselves have an incredibly important part to play. FMIs, their skill set here is in building enterprise and industry-wide consensus. And so driving consensus in things such as standards or resiliency or security or interoperability is really where market infrastructure should trend towards. Now that's all very well and good. And I think what's critical though is we understand what are those building blocks that we have to put in place to get there. And then very specifically to that rollout, what is the role that we want an FMI to take? So the first core element that I would argue is necessary is for an on-chain collection of assets and an on-chain means of payment. Now, I didn't say either or, I said both. It's absolutely critical that you have both on-chain. Otherwise, you end up in the situation where you're constantly crossing over different networks and eroding the value proposition that you can get with synchronicity. A case in point of this observation is seen by SIX, which is the Swiss digital exchange. They launched SIX Digital, I believe, in 2021 with their first bond issuance. On the margin, it was hugely successful. It functioned as designed. But it hasn't taken off. Why hasn't it taken off? Well, I'd posit there's two reasons it hasn't taken off. The first is targeted an asset class that already has been serviced in sort of the electronic environment we have today. There may be benefits on top of it, as we've discussed, but they're not as obvious as in the markets that still sit largely in a paper construct. So private market assets would have been an area to start. Nevertheless, it's around bringing more assets on-chain. Secondly, on the digital cash side, the minute that it got to settlement, you had the participants having to go off-chain and to fiat. As a consequence of this, they sat with multiple pools of liquidity, and that causes an inefficiency. So really what we're saying here is both sides have to be covered at a market infrastructure level. And again, we've got straight out the door here. On the asset side, this is something that a CSD has done before and can play an important role. On the money side, this is something that Bank of Africa itself could look into. So coming at it as a collective from market infrastructure to attack that dual-headed problem. The other difficulty, I guess, is that across money and assets, there's just this proliferation of different ways of achieving the end goal, and there's different commercial interests to get there. So on the asset side, you've got multiple networks, running off different blockchains, off different protocols, and it's largely a mess. And so any initiative that will start to try and bring that into a broader ecosystem of commonality is going to be important. You see perhaps with the Canton network from digital assets, unfortunately, I guess it's a bit of a walled garden, but at least they're making an attempt to try and bring many parties into the issuance layer. On the money side, again, goodness, who knows which way we're going to go here? Is it stable coins? Is it CBDCs? Is it cryptocurrency? Is it digital security networks? Is it tokenized deposits? I don't know the answer to that, and it could be one of those, it could be all of those, and it could be any particular commercial instantiation of it. And so with that, it highlights the importance of the next thing that we should be pursuing, and that's an interoperable design framework. This is fundamental in market infrastructure and markets as a whole. Fungibility makes assets move. And so the real challenge here for market infrastructure is to go out there, do what they do best, and start building standards for individuals to connect to. And then, I guess lastly in this particular picture is the approach that we need to take across the full trade life cycle. It cannot be that we have sort of primary markets sitting on-chain and secondary markets off-chain and then post-traders on-chain, and then sort of again you just get into this fractured mess. What's critical is that market infrastructures who play in each of those niches come together and they bring their full value chain onto the market. And I guess, simply put, what we're trying to pursue here is just this interconnected digital pools of liquidity, all run or implemented by decentralized financial market infrastructure. All right, so in summary, do FMIs matter? I've argued that decentralized finance absolutely has some value to add, and certainly value to add above what we've experienced today. But we've also acknowledged that financial markets today are fundamentally intermediated by centralized FMIs. But that doesn't render them obsolete. It is an opportunity for them to do what they do today, add the value that they do today, but to do it in a decentralized construct. If they don't do this, then back to that continuum, we sit with the risk of either doing nothing and not achieving any of the value that is promised through this technology, or we just end up in this anarchic chaos where everyone is trying to do something in an uncoordinated fashion. So in closing, my call out to my colleagues in financial markets infrastructure, this stage is read the signs. We need to collaborate. We need to have deliberate intent and purpose around the environment we're trying to create here, and we need to act. We need to act now. I think that's it. Goodness, that was quick. Thank you very much, everyone. Should we do Q&A? I don't think is Slido. We can do hands up if anyone's got anything. For both of you. Okay, there's a mic coming.
I guess one is an observation around your interoperable design framework, saying you could build lots of stuff, but you should actually decide the standards around which you build it so that you design for that level of interoperability. So it's a two-part question. One is sort of how would you bring the assets together to the payments? So in a simple construct, bring straight together with BankServe to say, let's solve the assets and the payment for those together. And then there's a second piece that says when you solve for payments, I guess you're solving for ZAR you're solving your local context, local assets, local money. But probably that interoperable design says I must look at what's going on globally because we know in the end, well, we're a global player, but also we must connect in a world that probably has more seamless exchange of assets cross-border and cross-border currencies. So maybe just some reflections on that.
No, I mean, I agree. I think at one level, you probably can't work as market infrastructure and market infrastructure alone. I mean, working with someone like CPMI or IOSCO would be a good area to drive global standards. So that would be the first prize. But that requires sort of critical mass from the individual market infrastructure demanding this. In a local context, absolutely. I mean, you've got people who deal with assets, and you've got people who deal with money. Those two have to come together, and it doesn't help if one is going off in this direction and the other one's going in the other direction. So there's a call out to market infrastructure across each of those verticals to engage directly. Then I guess on the other point, and I think it was Chris Hamilton spoke about it this morning, the money networks in particular, but asset networks are the same, work when there's critical mass. It's a network effect construct. So I don't think designing it for a local context is the only way. Yes, there's affinity, I think, to Hughes's words, but people have communities that extend past their national borders, and so it may be a good place to start, but it can't be done in isolation. So I echo your view. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Megan. I think you've made my question seem lighter. So my question really is, it's all about, the central bank sort of took strength to actually do something about this and actually prove that they understand what's happening. So the question then is, why FMI is not coming together to do this already so that we can move it forward if it's such a critical element in the payment space? And as well, in the picture, you also show that this is going to be over-collateralized. So meaning liquidity risk actually decreases. So why is the central bank still not really fully onboarded in the whole conversation?
I guess there's a couple of comments there. I mean, we've seen it elsewhere, and it was one of the risks in implementation, where the legal framework and the regulatory framework is such that enables this. Singapore, Switzerland, for example, you've seen the commercial enterprises tap in quite well. At the moment, you've probably got the market infrastructure sitting and looking at the broad regulation and saying, well, I'm not sure we can act just yet because we're acting into a space that isn't necessarily sanctioned. And so because of that, you sort of get these non-regulated entities playing into this environment. And that's great because it gets this fintech community building out. But then you start losing the opportunity of sort of these trusted financial intermediaries playing that role. I think they get too conservative when their underlying regulation is sort of uncertain or unclear. And it's not easy. I mean, there's this chicken and egg situation. I mean, first you've got to prove that there's a demonstrable business case. Like, what is not working today that we need to go into DeFi? And that might be a different answer in South Africa than it is elsewhere. I mean, arguably, the form of money in South Africa is not the most important problem that we're trying to solve. So perhaps it is in Europe, and maybe that's why we've seen it progress faster there. So I'm not saying it is the first place that the central bank should be focusing. And I think they have taken good steps, whether it's like Project Dunbar or whatever these things. They've started the experimentation, and that begets learning, and with the learning gets confidence, and with confidence comes regulation. So I think that's the right approach. Then on this sort of over-collateralization piece, it is tricky. I guess over-collateralization actually is a liquidity drain, so it intuitively sounds bad, but where there's no sort of market infrastructure in between and decentralized finance, there's no mechanism to do a credit score, and so to extend credit to someone else. And that does mean that you trap liquidity to some extent. And that's okay when everything is working synchronously on the margin. But when you have these on and off ramps where you've got trapped liquidity pools in various places, that over-collateralization in every discrete liquidity pool destroys the overall system. So to your point, maybe it's fine if there's interoperability between those liquidity pools. But if not, then it's kind of catastrophic. Thank you.
Can I throw you a quick last one? Do you think that FMIs have a responsibility to optimize the payment flow processing across the continent, specifically in light of what we're seeing dollar stablecoins do, driving the dollarization of the same continent that we live in? What do you think the role of the FMI is? Is there opportunity to lead the way as a clearing networks or that to try and set those interoperability standards to actually achieve that kind of fungibility?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So what is the role that FMI should take in that digital asset, digital money layer? They should be lowering the barriers to entry for tokenization. Okay, so that's the first step. What is that? That is creating a scheme, creating infrastructure, allowing people to operate with trusted market infrastructure in a low-cost, low-risk environment. So I think that's fundamentally the first role that FMI should take. And then if you go up the stack into that interoperable layer, well then don't narrow your sort of processing environment, your geographical reach. You should be thinking far afield. So interconnected, remember that was that kind of last ad, you want interconnected digital pools of liquidity. You can't have one without the other and try and achieve success. So yeah, absolutely, I think that's critical. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, for a very insightful discussion. Past the delegates, there's a breakaway session now in the room next door, and then join us for the last session at 4 o'clock in the plenary room. Thank you.